Thank you for watching True Crime Time. Hey everybody, for tonight's video I wanted to follow up on my last video where I had asked you all what you thought Bryan's alibi might be on the night of the murders. I wanted to address the most popular answer that I was seeing in the comments and then share with you what my theory is on what the defense's strategy is going to be when the trial begins. Let's do a recap on what's been going on with the case. So there has been some new documents that have been posted online and released. Most of this stuff is regarding the gag order and some different media entities filing motions here to have this gag order lifted. So there's this kind of back and forth going on where the media outlets are wanting access to information, and so they're requesting that these gag orders are being lifted. They're saying that it's basically causing them a hardship for whatever reason. And then Bryan's team, for the most part, is saying, no, we want this gag order to remain in place because it's important to protect Bryan's rights when it comes to the trial. We want to protect his information, and we don't want things being leaked out into the public that could impact the trial. They're wanting an impartial jury and things like that. And so that's kind of their argument here. And so there's this kind of back and forth going on between the media and Bryan's team. And then you have Kaylee's family involved with their attorney, who's also kind of part of that media side, who's kind of pushing for them to lift the gag order. They want to be free to say, what they want to say and address anything that's going on with the case. And so, they're also kind of pushing to have the gag order lifted. Pretty much just Bryan's team who's fighting to keep the gag order in place. I do think that's interesting because it tells me that there's some evidence out there that Bryan's defense does not want to be leaked. Bryan's defense is arguing that they want the gag order to remain in place because if they lift the gag order, they're saying it could potentially violate Bryan's 6th and 14th Amendment rights, which essentially means his right to a fair trial. They don't want something being leaked out there that could influence a potential juror in the case when it goes to trial. But a lot of these new documents that have been posted online, that's what these are. These are kind of this back and forth between the media trying to get this gag order lifted and then Bryan's team trying to keep it in place. There has also been a new video released regarding a traffic stop for Bryan. This was the traffic stop that occurred in October, just about a month before the murder happened. That will be my next video. I'm going to do a breakdown on that traffic stop and share some thoughts on that. There are a few interesting things in that conversation I wanted to talk about and get your thoughts on. And finally, we've learned recently that Bryan has a new attorney added to his defense team. This person has actually gotten somebody exonerated from a murder conviction in the past. So this actually kind of ties in with what I want to talk about later with my theory on what the defense is doing here. But before I do that, I do want to talk about that question I asked in my last video on what you thought Bryan's alibi would be. The most popular answer I was seeing in the comments on what Bryan's alibi would be was that he would have been there for some sort of drug purchase or drug sale reason, either buying it from the house or selling it to somebody at the house. More people were saying that he would have been there purchasing drugs from the house, but there were some comments out there about Bryan actually being the person who could have been selling drugs. Now that was the most popular answer to the question, and I'm sure most of you who have been following the case have heard about various drug sale rumors going on regarding the victims and the house and things like that. So if we talk about Bryan being connected to the house for either drug sales or drug purchases, the problem with that, if you're the defense, is you really have to support that with witnesses. You've got to have some phone records. You've got to have something there other than just them saying, well, yeah, he was there, to buy drugs, or he was there to sell drugs. You've got to have somebody else, an eyewitness account of somebody else who has purchased drugs from this house, somebody who knows Bryan, who, maybe has used drugs with Bryan, somebody who can at least come in there and say, yeah, this was going on. And I haven't seen anything really supporting that. We've heard a lot of rumors out there since this case began about drug sales and things like that, but there really hasn't been anything solid that I've seen or heard about aside from just that, just kind of rumors, flying around out there. You would think, after 5 months of all these rumors and people digging into this case, there would be something solid pointing to that happening in the house and there being some sort of connection there. And maybe it's out there. I just haven't really seen anything solid out there to support it. The other thing with that is it's definitely not a very good character image for Bryan. I don't necessarily think the defense wants people to look at Bryan as a drug addict, because drug addicts are unpredictable. And I don't necessarily think the defense wants to paint Bryan as an unstable person. I really think that their angle with Bryan here is this kind of clean-cut person who's pursuing his PhD, and I really think they're going to kind of stick with that. So by saying that Bryan was there to purchase or sell drugs or had some connection in that aspect, creates a bad character image for Bryan, which could backfire in the case, in my opinion. So I don't know if that's something that they would mess around with. The other thing with this drug connection is it places Bryan at the scene, and so now you're really having to kind of go down this path of explaining away, well, geez, you were just there moments before the murder. They're essentially admitting that he was there. And so now they really have to explain away him not committing the murder. He's essentially still a suspect by saying he could have potentially been at the scene. So by saying that he was there to purchase drugs or sell drugs, now you have to defend, well, why were you there in this little window? Why was your DNA on the knife sheath? And there's a lot more, to it than just saying, I was there buying drugs. So you're just admitting, right, that you were there. And I don't know if that's an avenue that they want to go down with the defense and then having to explain away all the questions that come along with the fact that, yeah, he was there, right? I really think that they're better off staying away from that and trying to find a way to say that Bryan just wasn't there at all. The other thing with the drug sale angle is it does in some way kind of shame the victims, and whether it's true or not, whether there was some sort of drug thing going on at the house, the defense kind of going down that route, it doesn't paint a very good image. Again, it kind of ties in with the character image of Bryan. Now you're trying to say that, the victims were involved in drugs. Well, does that, mean that they deserve to be killed, right? So I just don't feel like saying there is a criminal connection between the victims and the suspect is an effective defense strategy. Now, the angle, I think, with the drug connection that people are getting at, from what I've read, is, potentially somebody else could have been at the house and committed the crime, right? So it's planting that seed of doubt. So that does make sense. So I get kind of the idea there on, let's say that this was like a drug sale house and anybody could have been there, and maybe Bryan could have even said that somebody showed up and was wearing a knife on their belt and took it off and they used it to cut up drugs. Somebody commented that in there. It's definitely an elaborate explanation on, how the sheath could have ended up in the home. But again, you're placing Bryan at the scene and you're really having to get people to really believe that story. But the idea there, right, is creating doubt. And I do think that is what the defense is going to do, when they're putting everything together. I just don't necessarily think it's going to be based off of this kind of drug angle, drug sales or drug purchases. What my theory is here on the case, on what the defense is doing, and based off the documents that I've been reading through and just kind of how it's unfolding, is I really think they're focusing more on the actual DNA evidence. I think they're really trying to dig into how the evidence was handled regarding the DNA, looking at the genealogy connections, and they're even asking, to see the different notes and reports that were taken in the testing of this DNA evidence. And this isn't unusual. This is pretty common. The defense will often request this data in regards to DNA testing, and it's pretty standard. But they're very detailed in what they're looking for, because on the prosecution side, when they're testing DNA evidence, there's very strict protocols that they have to follow. And there are logbooks and things like that where they're taking notes and they're tracking the whole process of the DNA testing. And so the defense wants access to that, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to find an error there, a mistake, so that they can potentially get that evidence thrown out, right? Or at the very least create doubt about that evidence. So I really think what Bryan's defense is doing here is they're more focused on the DNA, the evidence handling, the investigative techniques. You can see in the documents, they're asking for some of that information, which I think probably why they're having to ask again here. And we have kind of this motion to compel discovery going on where they're saying, hey, we asked for this, we still haven't gotten it, is because it takes a little while to compile all of that and to get it all. So I'm assuming that when they go to this hearing that's coming up and they talk about this, the prosecution is probably going to be in the process of compiling the information for them. But they're essentially asking for all of these logs and notes on the DNA testing. They want to really focus in on the investigation, the officers that were part of the case. They want to find any officer in there that could have been connected to touching the evidence or processing the scene that has a history of any issues, and they can create kind of doubt on whatever their testimony is, or doubt about any evidence that person may have touched. The defense is even asking for past performance credentials and reviews and things like that of the people who processed the evidence. They're going to look for anything that they can to create doubt that evidence was handled properly. They want to know how they put it into the system and what they clicked on that led them to think it was Bryan's dad's DNA. They want to get all the way down into the details on the data that they inputted into the computer in their search when they were processing the DNA and trying to connect it to the genealogy. They want to really just kind of look for any mistake they can, because if they can find something big enough, they can get that piece of evidence completely thrown out, and they don't even have to address it, right? Like I mentioned, if they had said, well, Bryan was there for some sort of drug reason, now they have to explain away all these other things, these other questions. But if you can just get that DNA evidence thrown out altogether, well, now all they have really proving Bryan was there at the scene is maybe camera footage of a white car, right? Maybe they don't even have the license plate, but there's still some questions there on the evidence that kind of determines what the defense's strategy would be, whether or not they have Bryan's license plate or Bryan's face on camera in the car, or the car's license plate. Like I said, of course they're going to address that differently than if they just have a white car on camera and now they just have to explain away a white car. Well, there's 25,000 of those in the area. That's easy, right? So the defense is going to kind of piece out all of the evidence and try to get rid of whatever they can by disproving it or creating doubt in it, or get it thrown out, based off of, a mistake that was made in the processing of it. And then you don't have to explain away all of these questions that come up with kind of telling a story. Again, an innocent person, it should be pretty easy to tell the story. It sounds to me like they're looking for a lot of different types of loopholes and trying to manipulate the system in order to kind of get Bryan off the hook. But I don't think that they're necessarily proving Bryan's innocence here. The defense really wants to imply that law enforcement really just kind of focused in on Bryan and overlooked other potential suspects in the case. And they're going to try to get rid of that DNA evidence. They could even, for example, go after the way that the officers in Washington queried his vehicle and even kind of started looking at him as a suspect to begin with, right? So they're, the further kind of up the river, up the flow that they can get of this evidence and get it cut off and get it thrown out, the better for them. So for example, these Washington officers, something that concerns me is they apparently did some sort of query in a database regarding vehicles that were registered through the college, WSU, where Bryan was attending, and this white Elantra or white Elantras came up, and then these officers kind of did a check on this white Elantra. So if I were the defense, I would definitely be looking very closely at that, because I don't know if a warrant is required in that situation for an officer, for example, to run a database query in order to check registered vehicles. I don't know if that's a violation of some sort of privacy of the students or of Bryan, for example. And then shortly after they ran that query, I think it was maybe 30 minutes or 40 minutes after that database query run from the one officer. We had another officer at Bryan's apartment complex running that vehicle. I don't know if that is connected. I don't know if those two officers were communicating and the second officer went out there to follow up and look closer at that vehicle that came up on the query from WSU. But again, if I were the defense, I would be calling that out as saying, hey, these officers violate any rights of Bryan, and could you potentially even get that piece of evidence thrown out, and then it goes from there, So again, I really think the defense is going to be digging into this evidence and trying to kind of break it down piece by piece versus admitting Bryan was there to buy drugs and having to kind of explain away, him being connected to the victims and being connected to drugs and being connected to the potential other killer. Who is that other killer? You would think once again there would be a record of that. You would need a witness, some sort of phone records of this mysterious person who showed up with the knife. That type of explanation would be very hard, in my opinion, to convince a jury using that excuse. And DNA evidence is definitely something that a defense team who's qualified can dispute. There's been cases in the past where mistakes have been made. For example, there was a case in the past where somebody, their DNA came up as a match in a case, but it turns out that the lab that ran the DNA test reused a plate from a previous case where they had, another victim's and suspect's DNA, and that DNA came up as a match to the new case. And now, so, they convicted this person based off of that, but it was actually because of a contaminated plate that they had reused in the processing of the evidence. You have secondary transfer. You have even just the way that the DNA evidence was stored and transported. The defense could argue that the DNA could have degraded to a point to where it was unreliable in the testing. And then within the whole testing process, as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole kind of log and note-taking process. And what that's called is a proof argument. And so these lab technicians and the people who are testing the DNA, like I said, have a very strict protocol that they're following, and they're going to write a report kind of explaining their findings and how everything was handled. And this is the stuff that the defense is asking for. This is the stuff that the defense wants to kind of go through and look for anything that they can use against the prosecution. But again, the people who process this DNA evidence are trained on doing it this way. The defense is just asking for those records. So we'll see how all that washes out when it comes to trial. I've said in other videos in the past, I really think it's going to come down to, a lot of experts in this case. You're going to have experts testifying for the defense, experts testifying for the prosecution, and whoever's more convincing and whoever I think has the better supporting evidence backing up what they're saying is going to convince the jury. Really appreciate you watching, everybody. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. Hit the like button for me, and don't forget to subscribe. My next video will be coming out very soon, and you don't want to miss it.